Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about rational number conversions. Our content objective is students will be able to convert between rational numbers and percents. The language objective is students will be able to read decimals, fractions, and percent answers correctly. And why am I learning this? Well, it's important for real-world problems like finding the weight of your cell phone as a fraction. First, let's go over some background knowledge. So looking at this rectangle below, it's divided into 5 equal parts. It's going to ask us, okay, well, what would one part be expressed as a fraction, a decimal, and percent? So let's see. Let's assume we go ahead and fill in one part of the 5 rectangles. I would consider that 1 out of 5 as a fraction. Now as a decimal, I would divide 1 divided by 5, which would give me 2/10. And as a percent, that would turn into 20%. Okay, so now what about 3 parts? So I'm going to go ahead and shade in 1, 2 more, so a total of 3. So in this case, this would be 3 out of 5, which would convert into 6/10, which would then turn into 60%. So notice a fraction could be expressed as a decimal as well as a percent. Okay, so moving on. In previous grids, you may have represented 2700ths. That looks something like this. Okay, which basically is 27 out of the 100 squares are shaded, which means 27% of the squares are shaded. So notice you can write 27 hundredths as a decimal, as a fraction 27 hundredths, and notice these, you would read them identical. Okay, they're exactly read the same way. And then here you would see that it is 27%. So these are all equivalent representations of the same value. Okay, let's take a look at another example. What about a third? Well, here's an example of a third of the 100 squares. 33 1/3 out of the 100 squares are shaded, or you can think of it as 33 1/3% of the squares are shaded. So either way, notice all of these are equivalent. 1/3, 33 1/3 out of 100, and 33 1/3%. All of these are equivalent representations of the same value. Now let's go over some vocabulary. Rational numbers, you're going to hear this a lot in 7th grade, is basically a number that can be written as a fraction. So is 6/10 a rational number? Yes, because it can be written as a fraction. You would write it exactly the way it sounds, 6/10. What about -5? Absolutely. In order to make a whole number a fraction, you simply write a 1 underneath it in the denominator. So here, voila, it is a fraction, therefore it is rational. 2/3 is already a fraction, so of course it's rational. But what about 75%? Well, 75% is basically 75 out of 100. Okay, we're going to talk about that definition in a second, but obviously it could be written as a fraction, so therefore it is rational. And let's go into the definition of percent. I kind of touched base on it here. Percent, if you break up the word, it means per 100. Why 100? Well, cent means 100. Just think about, the word century, for example. A century is 100 years. So here, if it's 75%, it's 75 per 100, or out of 100. So again, that's why percents are rational. Now let's go ahead and practice. Here, we're given a couple information and we're asked to give the other. So here it's given us 63 hundredths as a decimal. How should I write that as a fraction? How should I write that as a percent? Well, as a fraction, it's going to be exactly the way it sounds as a decimal. 63 hundredths. Well, what about a percent? Well, there's two ways to do it. The first is to remember the definition. A percent is per 100. How much is it per 100? Well, it's 63 per 100, so it's 63%. Now, what's the other option? Well, a more popular way would be to say, okay, if we're moving a decimal to a percent, we're going to have to move it 2 to the right, so 1, 2, and that's going to leave us with 63. So both ways will work. Now here, what about 29%? Again, back to the definition, percent is per 100 because cent means 100. So in this case, since it's 29%, it is 29 per 100. The way you would read this is 29 hundredths, which looks like this as a decimal. Notice the way you read it are identical, 29 hundredths, 29 hundredths. But once again, another popular way of doing it is to say, okay, if I'm moving from a percent to a decimal, in this case, 29, the decimal is going to belong at the very end. With whole numbers, decimals are always at the far right end. Okay, then I would be moving my decimal 2 to the left. 1, 2, and that's how we would end up with 29 hundredths. Now, some of you may be wondering, okay, well, how am I supposed to know when I'm supposed to move my decimal to the right and when am I supposed to move my decimal to the left? How will I know? Well, let's think. In the alphabet, D does come before P. D for decimal, P for percents. Well, if we're moving from a decimal to a percent, we're going to be moving to the right to place values. Okay, again, D comes before P. Now, if it was the opposite and I'm moving from a percent to a decimal, I would actually be moving to the left. So here's a great way of remembering which direction you should go. I will be referring back to this every once in a while, so we'll practice it further in the lesson. Okay, so back to this. Here, as a decimal, we're given 7 hundredths. Again, reading it correctly really helps us out. Since this is 7 hundredths, I know as a fraction it should be written as 7 hundredths. Now, what about a percent? Again, a percent is per 100. How much is it out of 100 per 100? It's 7. So I'm going to go ahead and say this is 7%. But let's go ahead and practice using this method here. We're starting with a decimal and we're moving to a percent. That means we're moving towards the right. So here we're going to move our decimal 1, 2 places to the right, and that's what's going to leave us with 7%. Okay, what about 1.8%? What should I do here? Well, first of all, once again, a percent is out of 100. So how much is it out of 100? I'm going to say it is 1.8 out of 100. We have a dilemma here. In math, we don't want decimals and fractions all in the same number. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this decimal by multiplying it by 10, making it just into 18 over, in this case, no longer 100, but 1,000. Okay, so at this point, I can realize that it still could be reduced by 2, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, which is going to leave me with 9 over 500. So this is what it would look like as a fraction. But what should it look like as a decimal? I know this is technically the fraction that's been reduced down, but reading it as a decimal this way is a little bit more helpful. I would read this as 18 thousandths. So that is going to look like this. Now, I do want to go over one quick mistake that a lot of students will do. A lot of students will write it like so. But if you look very carefully, this is not 18 thousandths. This would be 18 hundredths because the 8 is in the hundredths place. So this is incorrect. So be very careful. Check. How would you read this? Does it match up with one of your equivalent fractions? But once more, I'm going to show you the other popular way of converting a percent to a decimal. In this case, since I'm moving from a percent to a decimal, I should be moving my decimal to the left. So let's practice that. 1, 2 to the left. Put that extra 0. I don't have any space, but you can see that it will still leave me with 0.18 thousandths. Okay. Moving on, converting fractions and decimals. First, let's understand that this means 3 divided by 8. So watch how I write it. As I'm reading it, 3 divided by 8, I will write it as so. 3 is going to be divided by 8. Okay? So first we're going to put our decimal down and bring it straight up. Can 8 go into 3? No. So we're going to put a 0 there, and let's add a 0 here. 8 can go into 30, let's say 3 times. That's going to leave us with 24 with a remainder of 6. I'm going to go ahead and have to drop an additional 0. 8 will go into 60, let's say 7 times, with a remainder of 4. And I'm going to have to drop down another 0. 8 will now go into 40 perfectly 5 times with a remainder of 0. So how would you write this as a decimal? I'm going to go ahead and say it is 375 thousandths. Okay, so now that we have it as a decimal, let's read it out loud. To read it correctly, we would read it as 375 thousandths. But you're probably wondering, wait a second, that is not this. Shouldn't they be the same? Well, first you need to understand that these two are equivalent. How can I prove it to you? Well, if I reduce both the numerator and denominator by 125, you would realize that it is equal to 3/8. So notice, this is equivalent to this, which is equivalent to this. So the other thing just to remember now is, what if it was written as a percent? How would we express that? Well, let's remember, here, if we're moving from a decimal to a percent, and it's always D before P, moving in this direction would require us to move our decimal to the right. So let's go ahead and rewrite this real quick and move it 2 to the right. 1, 2, and that's going to leave us with 37.5%. So yet again, this is another way of expressing the same exact value. They are all equivalent to one another. Okay, now one very important thing to remember is this. As a fraction, there is a top number and a bottom number, also known as the numerator and the denominator. Okay, well, when you're converting a fraction to a decimal, you're going to have to divide. Now, the setup of the division is tricky for some people, but know this, there's only one way to do it. It's always top number divided by bottom number. So in other words, the numerator is always divided by the denominator. Now, a very common mistake is a lot of students think, oh, it's always bigger divided by the smaller number. Yes, this happens sometimes, but is this always the case? The answer is no. It will always be top number divided by bottom number. And yet again, another way of rephrasing it is numerator divided by denominator. So please don't remember it as biggest divided by smallest. That is incorrect. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and go over a couple more examples before I let you try some on your own. Here we have 7/8. This means 7 divided by 8. So here we have 7 divided by 8. We're going to bring up that decimal. 8 cannot go into 0, but 8 can go into 78 times, which is 64, leaving us with a remainder of 6, bringing down that 0. 8 can go into 60, let's say 7 times, which is 56, with a remainder of 4, and bringing down that 0. 8 is going to go into 45 times. So as a decimal, I would say 7/8 is 875 thousandths. But what about a percent? Remember from earlier in the lesson we talked about, hey, percents are per 100, which is great for some examples, but notice this one's not per 100. In fact, I can't multiply 8 times a number to easily give me 100. So I'm going to go ahead and use the other popular method, which is to say, okay, D comes before P. If I'm moving from a decimal to a percent, I'm going to move my decimal 2 places to the right. So here, I'm going to go ahead and move it 2 to the right. 1, 2, which is going to leave me with 87.5%. Okay, now what if we're given 61%? Again, use what is the easiest. For me right now, I know the definition of a percent is per 100. So if it's 61 per 100, I'm just going to write 61 per 100. Also could be read as 61 hundredths, which conveniently gives me the decimal of 61 hundredths. So notice, using it both ways will allow you to move through these problems very quickly. So it's good to remember the definition of a percent as well as knowing which direction you should move the decimal. from when you're moving from a decimal to a percent, or from a percent to a decimal. Okay, moving on. So now at this point, it's finally your turn. I'd like you to pause the video and try 3 through 7 all on your own. So at this point, you probably went ahead and did whatever you were most comfortable, maybe moving the decimal to the right or to the left, or remembering what the definition of a percent is. Do what you feel more comfortable with. I am going to go ahead and introduce a couple more tips and strategies you can go ahead and use. Feel free to use if you're comfortable with them. Okay, so one thing is I really like to utilize the definition of a percent because I'm understanding numbers a little bit better that way. We do know that percent is per 100. So my question is this: is there any way I can make this per 100? The answer is yes. I can multiply a 5 by 20 to give me 100. So if I do the same to the numerator, I'm going to be left with 80. Here, I know that this is 80 per 100. So how much is that as a percent? It would be 80%. And conveniently, I can also read this as a decimal. It would be 80 hundredths. But before I do that, do you notice I can cancel out these 2 zeros, which would then be read as 8 tenths instead. So I'm going to go ahead and write 8 tenths as a decimal. Now, if you wrote the extra 0, you would realize, okay, it wasn't necessary. Now, is it wrong? No, but it is preferred that you don't add the additional 0. But again, if you felt more comfortable dividing this and converting it to percent and decimal that way, that totally works as well. Just wanted to provide you an additional option. Now here, 16%. Again, we know percents are per 100. So therefore, it's easy for us to see, okay, so as a fraction, it's just going to be 16 per 100. So I know right now it's not reduced, but right now I want to jump to a decimal real quick. This is 16 hundredths. That makes it really easy for me to write it as a decimal. It should be written as 16 hundredths like so. Okay, now moving back to this, I'm going to go ahead and reduce it because I notice it can be reduced by a 4, which is going to leave me with 4 over 25. So here are my answers. Let me circle the previous ones as well. Okay, so now moving on to number 5. This would be read as 9 thousandths because this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Okay, so as a fraction, let's write that. 9 thousandths. And there you go. Now here, what about a percent? How much is it out of 100? Now, technically, you could convert 1,000 to 100 by dividing both the numerator and denominator by 10. But if you're not comfortable with that, again, stick with the other method. Okay, we're moving from a decimal to a percent. So I'm going to be moving to the right 2 decimal places. So 1, 2. That's going to leave me with 0.9%. Okay, so once again, I do want you to utilize both so you're comfortable with the definition of a percent as well as knowing which direction you should be moving the decimal. Okay, so now once again, I'm going to show you that method. Since we know percents are out of 100, you're going to check, okay, could you make this out of 100? The answer is yes. You could multiply 10 by 10 to give you 100, so I'm going to do the same to the numerator. So 3 times 10 is 30, so it's 30 per 100, which makes this 30%. Now, what about a decimal? I know right now you can read it as 30 hundredths, but hopefully you realize that these zeros cancel each other out, and a better way of reading it would be 3 tenths. Now, some of you might be asking, well, what if I wrote it like this? Is it wrong? No, but once again, the 0 is not necessary. Okay, moving on to the last one. Here we have 270%. Percent, still the same. It's still out of 100, so let's write that. 270 per 100. Hopefully you see that these 0 cancel each other out, leaving you with just 27 tenths. Well, first, I want you to realize that this can be written as an mixed number since it is improper. So I'm going to just do some side work up here. We're going to do 27 divided by 10. That goes in twice with the remainder of 7, leaving us with 2 and 7/10. So I'm going to go ahead and write 2 and 7/10. So what does it look like as a decimal? It's exactly the way it sounds here. 2 and 7/10. And there you have it. So let me just circle my answers real quick, and here are the answers. So once again, you might have used a different method, which is totally fine, but I did want to show you some additional options you could use. Okay, so moving on. Converting repeating decimals and percents. So what do I do here? Here we have 1/6. This does mean 1 divided by 6, so let's set it up as so. Well, first let's bring up that decimal. 6 cannot go into 1, putting a 0 there. 6 can go into 10, so that's once. With a remainder of 4, bring down that 0. 6 can go into 46 times, which is 36, with a remainder of 4. Bring down as another 0. Wait a second, this is 40 yet again, so it is going to be a 6. And you're going to find that, the 6 keeps repeating. So to write it as a decimal, you're going to go ahead and write 0.16. And because the 6 is repeating, we're going to go ahead and put the repeating bar right above it. Now, what about a percent? Remember, percent is per 100, but there's nothing here that shows me how much it is out of 100. So that isn't helpful. And then there's not anything we can multiply 6 by to give me 100. So again, the next easiest option would be to remember, okay, D comes before P. Which direction am I moving? Well, I'm moving from a decimal to a percent. So I'm going to go ahead and move it to the right. So real quick, I'm going to go ahead and express this number like so, because we know the 6 keeps repeating. I'm going to now move the decimal 2 places to the right, which is going to leave us with 16.6. And yes, the 6 still repeats, so I'm going to go ahead and write 16.6 repeating on the 6%. So now I'm going to go ahead and go over a couple more examples before I have you try some on your own. So here we're given the fraction 8/9. This does mean 8 divided by 9. If you do the work, you should end up with 0.8 repeating on the 8. So how would you express that as a fraction? Sorry, a percent. Well, let's first remember percent means per 100. Unfortunately, we don't have any fractions that express the number per 100, and 9 can't easily be multiplied by a whole number to give me 100. So the next easiest thing is to remember, okay, D comes before P. I'm moving from a decimal to a percent, so I'm going to go ahead and move 2 places to the right. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and express this as an actual number, 0.888 ... Now I'm going to go ahead and move it 2 places to the right, like I said earlier. And that's going to give me 88.8 repeating on the 8%. Now let's take a look at another example, 5/6. This does mean 5 divided by 6. Now if you divide it, you will end up with 0.83 repeating on the 3. So that is my answer as a decimal. But what about a percent? Again, percents out of 100. There's nothing here that shows me how much it is out of 100, and 6 can't easily be multiplied by a number to give me 100, which is fine because there's just a quick way of doing it, and that is to go from a decimal to a percent, and we know we need to move to the right. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and write some more digits so we can see what the number looks like. I'm going to go ahead and move my decimal to the right 2 places. 1, 2, which ends up with 83.3, repeating on the 3%. Okay, now it's your turn, and I did give you a tricky one for number 10. So let's see how well you do. So let's see how well you did. Here, I am going to challenge you a little bit and see, can you see how it can be written per 100? Well, it is a 5, and it is possible. We can multiply the numerator and denominator by 20, which will leave us with 4 and 60 hundredths. But 4 and 60 hundredths doesn't tell me how much it is per 100. So the way to do that is to turn it into an improper fraction. 100 times 4 is 400, plus 60 is 460. So we're going to write 460 hundredths. So how much is that as a percent? Well, you can see here it's going to be 460%. Now what about a decimal? For decimal, I'm going to go back here. I would read this as 4 and 60 hundredths, but notice the zeros can be crossed, can be canceled out, and it should be just 4 and 6 tenths. So here are my answers. Now, is there another option? Yes, so let me show you. The other option would be to simply divide 3 by 5. So 3 divided by 5 would give you 6 tenths, like so. And then you can say, okay, that's 4 and 6 tenths. Then you can move the decimal to a percent. In which direction? It's to the right. So by doing that, you would see 1, 2 would leave you with 460%. Now I know that the other way for some may seem a little bit longer, but it is going back to the definition of what a percent really is. It's per 100. So I did want to show you how that worked out. But again, if you feel more comfortable simply moving the decimal either to the right or to the left to place values, that works just fine. Now, what about number 11? Here, you will have to divide 5 by 9. You should end up with 0.5 repeating on the 5. Now, what about a percent? Well, first thing that I would do is go ahead and write a couple more 5s to see what it would look like. And then I would go ahead and move the decimal place in which direction. Let's see. From a decimal to a percent, I'm going to be moving to the right. So I'm going to move it once, twice, and I should end up with 55.5 repeating on the 5%. Just like so. Okay, so that is actually going to conclude the lesson for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully you feel comfortable converting between decimals, fractions, and percents. And as always, until next time, bye!